How do you pick a deck for Yu-Gi-Oh? In this game, there's over 370 different decks to choose from, and it can be a little overwhelming to pick just one. So, as such, I've created this guide to help break down decks through a variety of methods, being general playstyle, required skill level, deck power level, and cost. All this so I can help you better understand what some of your options are, and consider what decks might be best for you. To simplify the overwhelming number of decks, I've picked out 20 of the most popular and powerful decks, and some others that I think are just great for new players. Let's get right into the playstyle breakdown. These different categories are generalizations, and a lot of these decks can be customized to play in very different playstyles. First off, we have our general decks. These do a little bit of everything, but nothing particularly well. These decks can often output a few disruptions easily, and have decent options for one-turn kills or OTKs. Next off, we have what I like to call toolbox and hand traps. Hand traps just mean that these decks tend to run extremely large hand trap packages. Cards like Ash Blossom, Infinite Impermanence, Nibiru, Effect Veiler, etc., etc. And by toolbox, I mean these decks are able to pull out an answer to everything. Sprite's main combo is effective against almost every deck, and Despia's branded fusion lets the player fusion summon anything out of the extra deck. This super consistent toolbox combined with hand traps lets the player solve almost any situation if they're clever enough. Our biggest category is Floodgate Control. These are decks that use big single effect cards to remove mechanics from the game or limiting the usability of certain card types. For fans of Magic, think stacks. These decks won't always rely on just one or two blow-up cards, but will have other disruptions backing them up. Exo Sisters, for example, make use of tons of other disruptions like Michaelis and Magnifica. However, some decks like Mystic Mine rely exclusively on a Floodgate. Next up, we have Spell Control. These decks have limited monster lineups and focus more on going one for one with the opponent with powerful spell disruptions, all while gaining value with powerful engine pieces. Both of these decks are very splashable into other engines, making for a very flexible strategy. Also listed here we have Burning Abyss, which is a representation of a classic control deck focusing on big trap disruptions and simple combos. Now here's the section for the very crazy combo decks. These decks are all about outputting insane inboards and still playing through disruptions. The catch is, they all have very complicated multiple step combos that change depending on the situation. When you see an incredibly long combo video, it'll usually be from this type of deck if the combo is going to see any play competitively. If you're a skilled player looking to show off their skill while having a variety of options available to you during a game, I recommend these decks. However, I think you might want to steer away from these decks if you're a newer player, unless you're willing to put in the time to learn some of these harder to play decks. Lastly, we have the OTK category of decks. These decks focus on getting the opponent to 0 life points as quickly as possible. That's not to say they can't go first, but both of the options on here are just really good at going second. Madolches have 1-card OTKs and easy removal. Frightfurs have tons of crazy fusion options, graveyard recursion, and field swarming. Every deck on this list will keep up at a competitive level and won't leave you completely out of luck at an event. However, some decks on this list are significantly better than others. Here are the weaker decks this format. Every deck on here is fun, but just lacks some of the tools to keep up against other decks. These decks are very strong at a local and casual level, but they aren't your best options to take to a competitive event. Here are the rogue decks this format. The decks here are not consistently winning events, but it's more than likely they'll show up in the top 8 spots. Some of these decks here might be just as powerful as the meta decks, but might require a very skilled player to play optimally, might need a bit of luck to see success, or might just be an unpopular playstyle or theme. Lastly, here are our meta decks. These are the decks that dominate events at the highest level. Do note that this category is subject to change over time with new releases and with new ban lists. The two most powerful decks are Teal Armaments and Sprites. If you only care about winning, I'd recommend starting with one of these decks. Now onto the difficulty of play for each deck. Here are the harder to play decks. Notice most combo decks fall into this. That's because these decks take a lot more memorization and or creative thinking to play well. It might not be that much if you're an experienced Yu-Gi-Oh player, but for a beginner, it can be a lot. Life Prince and Runic also fall into the more difficult space, requiring the use of some unique gimmicks and disruptions for max value. Here we have the middle road decks. Most of these decks either have easier straightforward combos like Despia, or extremely intuitive like Fluffles or Sky Strikers. These decks still have a lot of room for a good player to really show off the decks. Here are the decks with even more straightforward combos, or 1 or 2 floodgate options that simplify the game state. If you want to get away with the lowest skill floor for a deck, I'd recommend one of these. Lastly, here's Mystic Mine for being a brain dead deck that reduces the game purely to luck. I would say don't play this, but it is cheap, and some people enjoy doing that to their opponent. At this point, you've probably gotten a very good idea what you want to play. We'll use the fun part, where I bring reality into the picture and remind you all about the price. Do understand that this section is subject to change over time, and is intended as a general guide. Here are the budget decks this format. Budget is defined as anything that can be obtained for less than $300. Yeah, I know, that's a lot of money. Unfortunately, if you want to play at a decent to semi-competitive level, that's often what you're gonna have to spend, unless you can find a playgroup to change the rules and accepted cards. Here we have the middle decks. Anything from $500 to $300 fits in this section. These are the very middle of the road options. Here we have the expensive decks, or anything that's regularly going to cost you over $500. Typically these have expensive engine pieces, or need expensive staple cards to function. Lastly, we have the decks whose price largely depends. Eldlich, for example, can focus on larger floodgate style builds, or can combine with several other decks and engines for more aggressive playstyles. Overall, with all of these decks, there are certain cards you can cut to make them cheaper, but you will be putting yourself at a significant disadvantage, especially as you get into more and more competitive circles. I wish price wasn't a factor when deciding what to play, but that is the world Konami wants us to live in, where poor people aren't a part of it. So taking all this into account, what are my recommendations for new players? Despia is relatively cheaper, easy enough to understand, and has tons of room for a player to learn with the deck. It's also one of the best decks for a more general playstyle. The Brandon Fusion Core can also combo well into other Fusion decks, meaning the deck can be used to build other decks. Here's a hand trap oriented build for Despia, which I quite like, which I think is really good for learning the basics of the game. However, it's fallen out of popularity when compared to this other build I have, which is more combo oriented, making use of cards like Frightfur Fusion to get even more value. Eldlich is an easier deck if you like controlling the opponent with one-card powerhouses. Eldlich can be built on a budget as well. Eldlich also blends well into other decks, meaning the core can give players flexibility. Here's a Fusion Floodgate-oriented Eldlich. It's got the classic skill drain at 3. It combines with Despia for easy value. Floowandereeze are very similar to Eldlich, albeit with a bigger combo focus and more built-in powerful options. This deck qualifies as anti-meta. Floowandereeze have more or less a standard list, and this is it. Frightfur is a fun combo OTK deck that is extremely intuitive. The deck is extremely cheap. Here's a link to my deck profile on it. It is for Master Duel, but I think you'll find with a few substitutions, it'll work quite well. Sky Strikers is a very fun control deck if you want to focus on one-to-one interactions with the opponent. There's a lot of room in this deck if you want to learn and get better. And with the new Magnificent Maven set, the deck is getting new support and reprints of older cards, helping to keep the price down a little bit. Here's a more budget build for Sky Strikers. Spright are one of the best decks in the game right now, and my only expensive recommendation. They're extremely easy to pick up and start playing with. If you have experience in another card game on a competitive level and want to jump right into Yu-Gi-Oh!, I'd recommend this deck as a solid choice. Sprites have an insane amount of splashability, including with several other decks on this list. There's a ton of options if you want to branch out into other strategies. Here's a more generic build and a great place to start learning the deck. Here's an Evil Twin variant if you want a more combo focus. And lastly, here's a Runic build for more control and disruption focused players. Personally, I like this build the best, although which one is actually the best is up to you. Out of all these decks, the one I personally play the most right now is Rika. It's fun, I'm a big fan of plant combo, and lets me show off what I know as a combo player. I can't really recommend it to new players, unfortunately, but if you wanted to know what I personally played, that is what I play. And that's about it for the summary of what decks I recommend. Honestly, if you like any of these decks on these lists, I would recommend checking them out if you're interested. I and a lot of other YouTubers have deck profiles. I'll link some of them in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.